History has shown that since the beginning of time, we humans have tried to control and manipulate nature. We wish not only to control it, but also bend it to our will. Our obsession with control has driven us to where we are now. Some would call this progress, but some would call it our destruction. As the Roman Empire came into being, the creation of glass itself was born. From the glass all things began to thrive, and science as we know it emerged. The secrets of the craft were hidden among kings, queens, and nobles for centuries to come. From Constantine to the Crusaders up until the Age of Enlightenment, empires were built from the secrets they possessed, yet these same empires also fell by the wayside as time passed. Not all of the power and influence they possessed could save them in the end. Rome was abandoned by Constantine for the beauty of his Byzantine Empire. From Rome to Constantinople, from Constantinople to Venice, glass soon could not keep its secret from the rest of the world, and the spread of its marvel began. Scholars at one time would use glass bowls filled with water in order to observe the behaviors of light. First there were little bottles of perfume, then chandeliers. Finally came the microscope and telescope. The world was amazed by what progress possessed. We still are today, but what was the cost? Today we have scientists that suggest we are no more than a computer simulation. Just as Aristotle used glass to determine the secrets of perception, we are opening our consciousness to the unknown. Genes that are groomed by generations of breeding, passed down from our forefathers before us, picking the best of the stock in order to perpetuate the breed and further our immortality. The Greeks would travel abroad in search for the meaning of life, taking them too far off lands. Scholars, philosophers, and adventurers would travel to Egypt, searching out its deepest secrets. On their journey, they eventually encountered the stories of Aphrodite and her indiscretions. The rose given to Hippocrates and delivered to him by Eros, Aphrodite's son, as a gift for his silence concerning those indiscretions. Silence is golden, just as it is also consent. Ignorance is also bliss, and we turn a blind eye in order to protect what we feel is ours. King Louis VII's entire family died from smallpox. His brother died as a baby because the doctors performed bloodletting. If it wasn't for King Louis VII's governess refusing to allow the procedure, he would have died as well. Let us not talk about this king, though, especially when it comes to secrets. Kings and queens would breed according to stock. They needed an heir to carry on the family name, thereby keeping power within their fold. Henry VIII was on a deadline for a son and produced only a daughter that could take his throne in the end. At the early age of 11, King Louis VII was introduced to his betrothed wife-to-be. The royal family wished for him to be married to his cousin. He wasn't really interested, though, considering she was only 11 and his bride-to-be was but 3. So they hurried off and found a Polish princess to take his cousin's place, who was old enough to conceive. An unquenchable thirst was born, and secrets of illegitimate children were hidden from his subjects. What would the people say? Traditions carry on from each generation, it seems, and we have an explanation for it according to the scientific method. Let's talk about King James as well, and the misconceptions concerning his life. The idea that playhouses in London were the place to be during that era was far from the truth. Reprobates and homosexuals who practiced beastly things gathered in those places. King James frequented there often in search of male lovers, and nobody said a word. To this day, there are even conspiracies concerning Shakespeare, wondering if he ever really existed. Was he actually just a pen name for a person of royalty or someone of high standing wishing to stay anonymous? Nobody of reputable background would have ever been caught in such places, like the playhouses in London. The things that Shakespeare wrote about were well beyond his reach. He knew about the law and was a writer with only a seventh grade education. He could have never gained such information. The Order of the Golden Fleece and its dirty little secrets. Secrets of the confessional. What was said and done in the banquet room stayed in the banquet rooms. Generations of noble families were held as political prisoners in order to uphold the king's order. People would flee from their homes, exiled to far-off lands, away from the church. Meaningless wars were fought for land and treaties, most without reward for either the people or their kings. Tributes had to be paid and hostages taken, because if not, then conspiracies were formed. Referendums and counter-referendums were made in order to preserve nobility. Out of all this secret societies, such as the Freemasonry, the Rosicrucian, and other Hermetic groups, were formed. This, of course, resulted from years of persecution from the Golden Fleece and other secret courts. These courts held trials by oath to determine guilt or innocence. The penalty for any crime that a person was accused of was death. Secret handshakes, meetings among members, and judgment was given only by the accused peers, was the law of the land. If you weren't a member of that group, you better know someone who was. Not knowing the right people would have certainly been the death of you. You then either ran for your life or you were hung from the nearest tree, because there weren't any jail time after guilt was established. Some of the greatest lies ever told to man are obvious, and yet we look away from the truth. We accept the lies told to us, instead of understanding that these are not fact but lies. First, we were led to believe that the earth was flat. Then we were taught that everyone thought that the earth was flat. Historically, though, this is far from the truth and inaccurate. Not all societies and civilizations believe this to be true. There are plenty of historical facts that state otherwise, though we have been fooled into believing the lie. While civilizations formed and folklore began to dominate societies within these civilizations, pockets of individuals also studied the skies. When villagers feared curses and sacrificed their children to gods, these few individuals calculated the full circle of the equinox around the ecliptic. They understood the returning of the planets and the circle of the same, the great year, perfect year, the platonic year, or whatever you would wish to call it. They understood the gyration of the axis and the equinox procession. Without shame, most people are cowards, filled with greed and vanity, always competing for resources, power, and notoriety in order to gain these things. It's required that the masses must be controlled and influenced. In order to acquire resources, blood has to be spilled, and our young have to be sacrificed for the greater good. A life, for the sake of the spring. Blood sacrificed in order for the water to flow. Lotteries created evolved into words like the draft, and our children soon march blindly into death's shadow. This was all done in the name of patriotism. The ancient Greek and their elites debated over philosophy, optics, and the stars. Their population consisted of 80% slaves and only 20% free men, yet these were the origins of democracy. According to critics, Ptolemy was a fraud. Plato knew nothing of the stars, and Pythagoras was just a fictional character. The math still exists, though, just like the story of Jesus himself, both without evidence of fact that historically back them up. To think outside of the box is criticized by your peers, ridiculed because you don't share the same experience or beliefs. Still, we are told that we must sacrifice our young for the sake of the many, and we do not take a moment to figure it out. We and the elites are not one and the same. We are segregated with two separate purposes and standards. The rich enjoy their wealth by manipulation through standards and symbolism. While exiled in Babylon, the Jewish created their text in order to return their identity as God's chosen people. They were living with pagan barbarians, of course, weren't they? People who worship gods by laying on their own excrement, yet understood the moon's cycle by the 5th century BC. It is also a wonder how Babylonian ideology found its way into the Talmud, and then eventually the Quran. We are placed in positions accordingly. If we are smart enough, though, we can climb our way out of the cesspool through the use of fame, intellect, money, and beauty. Even then, though, we may still be called upon to sacrifice ourselves or loved ones for the greater good. The greater good, of course, being a small percent of people who enjoy living in penthouses or in the south of France. It's all about want and needs. And the object of the game is the rich manipulating the poor in order to gain what they want, usually by monopolizing resources, then extorting us with laws that we then submit to without disagreement. It is only when laws affect the elites negatively that those laws change. Poor people and their families are nothing more than pawns on a chessboard. The system was created long ago when scholars were establishing the moon's monthly elongation, while making predictions on lunar and solar eclipses, while trying to understand the physical form. When the Chinese thought that the moon was pure energy, but understood that moonlight was the reflection of the sun. Intellectual elites were given privilege because of their contribution to society. Heroes were idolized and created from their conquest of war for their deeds done against the enemy. These things continue still, always with the promise to restore peace, love, and tranquility. Nothing is further from the truth, though. Alhazen, Ptolemy, and Archimedes theorized about the earth, sun, and the moon, while the ignorant and uneducated were subjugated with folklore and superstition. Churches set gargoyles upon their archways, creating fear within the fellowships, denying them the ability to read and understand the stories painted on their church windows and ceilings. Easily controlled by the system, things remained that way for some time. With the rise of science and the invention of the printing press, theories began to develop, expanding our way of thinking. More people became literate, creating new ideas. Galilei was forbidden to speak of his discoveries. It was blasphemy to the church. Soon, though, there were no boundaries between the spheres of the mutable elements and imperishable stars. The moon wasn't smooth but full of craters, created by asteroids that collided into its surface. Kings gathered in high places, pondering on solutions to their problems at hand. New ideas developed in order to control the masses, while old ideas were cast aside. Instead of God, it was determined that complex organisms couldn't have developed without the relationship between the Earth and the Moon, even though some intellectuals would debate on that theory too, stating, other than helping life to evolve easier and keeping Earth straight, the Moon isn't of much help to us. There are no scientific models available showing that two large objects collided and coalesced in Earth's atmosphere, pulling the smaller body towards proto-Earth, creating the Earth's moon system. Educated idiot. Still, the ruling class was gracious while they changed from kings and queens into the elites, changing their persona and status while meeting their growing needs, building towers that climb above their surroundings, overwhelming us in hypnotic spells and grandeur. We worship the Eiffel Tower, Golden Gate Bridge, and even the Twin Towers that fell in recent years. The blood of children are smeared upon the foundations of those structures, but do we care? We place our vanity at the doorstep of two buildings while victims still perish today. We send our children off into the darkness and some don't return. While the elite class explains the situation to us, we must view things along two separate lines of sight. The displacement of our line of sight and our difference in position or our place in the world. Remembering that objects in the rearview mirror are closer than they appear. Sometimes we see that the driver isn't driving 50 miles an hour, when in reality he isn't. Sometimes we see that the driver is driving 50 miles or 55 miles an hour, when in reality he isn't. We are looking at the speedometer from the wrong angle, seeing the actual speed a little off than what it really is. What a person sees when he looks into the sky in the United States isn't necessarily the same as what a person in Syria sees when he looks into the same sky.